In this presentation we'll be looking at how grids and patterns work together, how grids enable you and have enabled craftsmen over the centuries to be creative. And what I want to do in this lecture is to show you some ways that craftsmen did this. Some ways of using grids are more complex than others, but some are very simple. And the effectiveness of using grids in a creative way will hopefully become apparent in this lecture. The most basic grid is a grid of squares, as you can see here. Here's an arrangement of 9 squares in 3 rows and 3 columns. That provides the basis for many geometrical compositions. Any little pattern that you can make in one of those squares, you can then tessellate, repeat in the other squares, and you create a bigger composition. That's a very simple and very essential principle, as we've already seen. If we were to do something creative with this grid, without changing it, without changing the way the squares are aligned, or the way the squares are placed in relationship to each other, we could rotate it like this. It's still a grid of squares, except that the squares are on their points, they're diagonally aligned. But if you had a pattern in a square and you rotated the grid and you therefore rotated the pattern, what would happen? It seems like a very simple question, but it's surprising when you see the result, how different patterns appear if you do that. So here is a pattern based on a familiar 8-fold pattern in a square, and this pattern has been tessellated into 9 squares in total, and this is the result. And I'm sure this pattern will be familiar to many of you. If, however, we then rotated it, it looks like this on the right, and you can see that it looks very different. It's the same pattern, it's been rotated. Its appearance is really different. It's a very simple thing to do, but very effective. So let's look at that again. Here I've highlighted the same pattern, but have given the squares of the grid different colors, just to make it a bit more clear. And there's the same pattern again, rotated. Same pattern, rotated, has a completely different appearance. Just by making a grid of squares where the squares are on point creates a very different composition. And if we look at this large ceramic tile composition from the Alhambra, what can we see here? It looks like a very complex composition, but we can recognize elements from it. So we can see these large stars, for example. These are 16 pointed stars. Between them you can see 8 pointed stars with 8 petals around them. And then in the middle you see something quite different, something that the craftsman made specifically for that spot, because it's the middle of the composition. He wanted to have something that had a very clear visual appeal. But if we were to deconstruct this composition, if we were to look for the grid that the craftsman would have used to make this composition, we get this. And you can see that the grid is essentially very simple. It has also a grid of squares where the squares are on their points, so diagonally aligned. Not only that, if we then analyze all the components that make this composition, you can see that there aren't that many of them. We can count them. We have the large 16 pointed stars. There's 2 complete ones and there's several half ones at the top and the bottom. We have the central element, which is the same size as the 16 pointed stars, but is different because the craftsman wanted to do something special in the middle. Then we have the 8 pointed stars here and here and here, and they appear all over the composition in these diagonal bands. And then where these diagonal bands cross, the craftsman has also done something different. There are 4 different elements in this composition, and it's easy to see how they all work together to make this big composition. Without the grid it would be more difficult to understand that. It would be more difficult to visualize that, and that's what I hope to be able to show in this lecture, that learning to see how grids form the basis for compositions will help you understand them, but it will also help you in the future to be creative in Islamic geometric design. So here is a famous plaster panel also in the Alhambra, and it has beautiful carved plaster at the top, beautiful calligraphy, and then it has this geometrical pattern beneath it. If we look at it in close-up, you can see that this is a 12-pointed star. We can count the petals if we wanted to. We can count the little card shapes that are around it. And this composition also looks quite complex. It's hard sometimes to see how this composition works. However, if you then visualize a grid of hexagons, like I've indicated here with red lines, you can see that it's one single pattern that fits in a hexagon, which is then tessellated to make a bigger composition. And this is not a very difficult pattern to make, in fact. We could do the same thing again. So here is another very nice geometrical pattern in Seville. It's also a 6-fold pattern. You can see that because there's little 6-pointed stars in the middle, for example. You can also see that because these little, what I call hammer shapes, there's 6 of them around each little star. You would know, or you would be able to know, that at the basis of this composition would also be a grid of hexagons. And the trick is trying to figure out what the shape is of the hexagon, what is the boundary of each repeat unit. So you can see that here. I've also indicated that with red lines. You can see you can make this pattern to fit in a hexagon, and then you tessellate the hexagon and you get the bigger composition. So these past 2 patterns that I've shown you are all tessellated like this, a grid of hexagons. You can also see, for example, with this pattern consists of hexagons, and it's one of the most simple patterns to make in Islamic geometric design, or one of the most simple patterns to make in 6-fold Islamic geometric design. If we just look at a dark brown hexagon, you can see that all that's going on there is a simple 6-pointed star placed in the hexagon, and the 6-pointed star is made by drawing 2 overlapping triangles. Very simple. Then when it's tessellated, it makes this bigger composition. The reason I show this composition, because I want to get on to the next phase of grids, where you don't have a grid that consists of one shape only, like a grid of squares or a grid of hexagons, but instead you can add other elements to the grid. So for example, here we have a grid of hexagons and triangles. It's a pattern in itself, of course, but this can form the basis of a grid. If we keep the content of the hexagon the same as we saw in the previous pattern, so if in this hexagon, in all these dark blue hexagons, we had little 6-pointed stars, and then if we did something else in the little triangles that we've added, you can see what happens. So you can recognize hopefully the familiar element, like in the dark blue tile you can see that familiar 6-pointed star. In the triangles, in the lighter blue triangles, I've added a very simple smaller triangle, and then when it's tessellated it makes a completely different pattern, like this. So even though it looks very different, it's construction-wise it's not very different from the first pattern I showed just earlier. This principle can be applied in many, many different ways, and it's also a way that allows you to be creative. By taking, for example, a familiar simple pattern that fits in a square or a hexagon, and then adding, in this case, a triangle, doing something creative inside that triangle. Not all combinations will work, but it's a matter of trial and error, and it will end up creating something new. We saw how you can add a triangle to a grid of hexagons to make a different kind of grid. You could take it one step further and have a grid with, for example, 3 elements. In this case, you would have a hexagon, a triangle, and a square, which you could then turn into a grid like this. You could then make a composition which had 3 different elements. One element, one pattern that goes inside the hexagon, another pattern that goes inside the square, and another pattern that goes inside the triangle. And this sort of behind the scenes variable that exists in Islamic geometric design enables you to experiment, essentially. I also want to show you how you can use only 2 different elements in a grid and then be creative by making different combinations with those same 2 elements. So for example, here you see a grid that consists of squares and triangles, very simple. And here you see another grid consisting of only squares and triangles. And you can imagine that if you have a pattern in the squares and a pattern in the triangles, and you keep those the same for both different grids, for the grid on the left and the grid on the right, that you'll get a very different outcome in the geometrical pattern. Another variable, of course, would be to only use the grid on the left, for example, for argument's sake, but then changing the content in the square without changing the grid. Those are basically the main ways that grids enable you, and have enabled craftsmen over the years, over the centuries, to try different things, to come up with things that they weren't necessarily planning. There's an interesting example, a unique example, in the history of Islamic architecture and in the history of Islamic geometric design about how a grid creates a composition. Grids are always invisible, the only exception being the one that I'm going to show you now. But regardless of where you go in the Islamic world, whether it's Uzbekistan or Iran or Iraq or the south of Spain or Morocco or Egypt, you never see grids in action. In fact, you always see the end result, although you can analyze a pattern and see how a grid would have made compositions possible. They're a trade secret. Craftsmen use them, but they never show them in the final result. The notable exception being here in Cairo at the Mosque Madrasa of Sultan Hassan, which is a wonderful building, very large. If you've been to Cairo, you would have probably visited it. It has a very big pishtaq, a very big entrance, and near that entrance on the right is a niche which has a geometrical composition, like you can see here. And you can see that it has black lines and it has white bands or lighter bands. The lighter bands are what you're supposed to see. The black lines are the lines that you're not supposed to see, the lines that make the grid. And it's interesting to wonder why this is visible, why the craftsman chose to show these black lines. There's different theories that you could have. Perhaps it was the case that this was a junior craftsman who had been instructed by his boss to make this composition. Maybe there was some time pressure. He didn't understand what was supposed to be visible and what was supposed to be invisible, and put the grid lines in as well. If this was the case, you wonder how his colleagues would have reacted when he made essentially a trade secret visible for the whole world to see. Whatever the reason is, it's very valuable to us now, because you can see, for example, that there's in the middle of the grid, the black lines show that there's an octagon in the middle, and then above that is a diamond shape, which has a specific shape, which is also visible on the left and on the right. Then there's another shape here, which contains sort of what we call a bottle shape. You can see the whole way it's been constructed. Here is the same pattern again, but then in an illustration of mine. So this is what the craftsman made. This is the grid that he used. And it's fascinating because it really gives us an opportunity to see something that we were not supposed to see. But for those of us who are interested in Islamic geometric design, it really gives us an invaluable clue as to how craftsmen worked. I'd like to finish this lecture by showing you this composition. It's something that I made a year or two ago, which initially was supposed to be published in my second book, but not all drawings made it into the book. But it shows you a geometrical composition with 3 different elements, and you can see the grid that I've used. In blue are 6-fold star patterns. In the orange, squares are simple octagons, and then in the green, 12-sided shapes are 12-pointed stars. Even though it creates quite a complex composition, the grid does all the hard work, essentially. If I can draw this grid of squares, hexagons, and 12-sided polygons, then that's most of the work done. And then it's just a matter of filling in the patterns for each of these 3 different shapes, for the hexagon, for the square, and for the 12-sided polygon. And it creates a very nice, complex composition. So this is how grids and patterns work together. Understanding this not just as a tool for analyzing compositions, but also as a tool for being creative is really invaluable. It will help you a lot if you take advantage of the interaction between grids and patterns.